It's not your fault.
Sorry?
It's not your fault. Go ahead.
Oh, that's, it very likely is, actually. So, welcome everyone to our session on the Spanish flu of 1918, the pandemic of 1918. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time because I'm coming late to the session, and you'd much rather hear Aaron and Tim make their presentations. And did I hear, as I was scrambling to get on, that David was in fact joining us, or he's not?
No, it's a different David. So it's just
Eric Johnson might have some remarks to make, and he's online.
Okay.
And Ray Hudson also might be contributing some as well. And they're both online, and when it's their turn, I'll bring them over to talk.
Well, terrific, Bill. There's no need for me to do much in the way of introducing a flu epidemic. We're all living with COVID-19, was very similar in a lot of ways. And it's one reason, I think, why the flu of 1918 just over 100 years ago is so interesting to us. But let's get started with Tim. Many of you know Tim Troll. He's has been down in the lower Yukon since the early 1980s, and he's a member of the board of the Historical Society and serves as director of the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust. And Tim's going to tell us something about the Spanish flu in Southwest Alaska, the Bristol Bay and Alaska region. I think without any further ado, Tim, why don't you go ahead and launch in, because you're the one we want to hear.
Well, all right. Actually, I'm going to be talking, at least initially, about the flu in Bristol Bay. It actually came into Bristol Bay in 1919. It had also gone into Alaska, came into Alaska in 1918, and came up the Southeast Panhandle and got all the way down the Yukon and out to Nome, where it was quite devastating. Seemed to have been diminished come the winter of 1919. There were concerns that it would get into Bristol Bay, didn't come. So what I'm gonna, I was engaged last year to put together a little book for Bristol Bay Native Corporation that wanted to remember the flu. And we completed that in December of 2019 to celebrate the 100th anniversary, out of concern that people should remember this event, because otherwise it would be totally forgotten. And then of course in December, we've subsequently learned that that's when COVID began over in China, and all of a sudden I've run out of copies of the book. So we're now making more copies for the folks in Bristol Bay. But what I'm gonna do first is show you a short film. This is a film that I've been working with Katie Ringsmith and Bob King. We're involved in this Diamond NN project. And the Alaska Packers Association, the canning industry, had a big role to play in the response to the flu in Bristol Bay. And so in 8 minutes, I can tell you what I would otherwise tell you in a half an hour. So we're gonna play the little film. And then after that, as a result of this work, I was contacted by some folks in the Coast Guard who were putting together a history of the Coast Guard cutter Unalga that was part of the Bering Sea Patrol in 1919 and visited on Alaska and visited Bristol Bay during the flu. And some of the crew members apparently had some photographs of that, so we were able to obtain these photographs of the Unalga and the response mostly on Alaska. So I don't know very much about the flu on Alaska. We were interested in the Unalga's trip because of its response in Bristol Bay. So I'll show the film first, and then I'll go through a little PowerPoint and show you these photos that I don't think too many people have ever seen, and then move on from there. So I'm gonna try to share the screen here, and we'll start with this little film. Okay.
One day I got a call from the city manager of Dillingham saying that some fisherman from Washington had dropped by a beautiful old wooden box, and inside of it was a note that said, "This is a gift from our family to the people of Dillingham. Our grandfather was a doctor at the hospital, and people really gave him a lot of these things because they liked him so much, and we thought we would give it back." Out of curiosity, I did call, obviously, to thank them for the gift, wanted to know more, and then asked, "Do you happen to have any photographs, journal entries? Did he keep diaries, correspondence?" And yes, we have, we think, over 500 photographs. After looking at the photos long enough, the story began to unravel. We came to realize that Dr. French actually started the hospital at Kinnickinnic in Dillingham. He did house calls, and his house calls ranged from Togiak to the far west in Bristol Bay, all the way to Ugashik and on up into Lake Clark area. We realized, particularly by looking at these photos and these groups of children, is that these were orphans from the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1919. The flu did get into Bristol Bay, probably in May of 1919. How? Not really sure. The story is not so much how it got in there. The story is the response. How did they deal with it? When the Alaska Packers Association arrived, they have their full crew, they have their doctors. The flu is already there in most of the villages where they were doing their canneries. The only government representatives were Dr. French and 2 nurses at the time the flu hits. The flu affected adults significantly, but there was a certain age group of young children that it didn't affect. So orphans were created. When they get into Bristol Bay, they're finding that the adult population has pretty much already been very sick and decimated. They're responding, they're doctors, they're providing what care they can. The stories you get are heartrending of the cannery coming and finding children in the sod huts with their dead parents there, ravenous dogs around, all kinds of things. A very horrific situation, and responding to get those kids taken care of. If the canneries had not come when they did and did what they did, many more would have died, and certainly we don't know what would have happened to these children. Now we have all these kids to take care of. How are we going to do that? There were tents that were set up to house some of the orphans. Konaknak did build an orphanage, and it became an industrial school for boys and girls. There's not a family that wasn't touched by that disease. And in a sense, the canning industry, it had its downsides and its upsides. But to the credit of the industry at the time, they took on this task. I think they realized that their success in the region depended upon their ability to relate to the people who were in their villages. Big flu epidemic is not something you celebrate, but it's also not something you forget. To me, it's a story of courage. I mean, there's obviously the stories we'll never know about how people survived this thing or helped others survive. But we also see in Dr. French and the nurses and the untold cannery workers and confronting this, what they did in order to take care of people. It's an incident in history, particularly for Bristol Bay, but also for the state. This is your story, it's our story. Let's not forget it.
So can you hear me?
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, so that film was created basically for the, this is what we're calling the Diamond NN project, the cannery in Bristol Bay, that the oldest actually surviving intact cannery that we hope to make into an exhibit at some point. And this will be just one element of the story, talking about how the canning industry participated in this response. So as I was saying, the flu got into Bristol Bay in May. Dr. French himself got sick. But one of the first things they did is they did send a message to a Coast Guard cutter, the Onalga, saying that they needed help in Bristol Bay. Could they please come and respond? At that time, the cutter Onalga was near Unalaska. And it also gotten a similar report from Unalaska that the flu was rampant there. So rather than responding directly, the captain in charge, Captain Dodge, went to Unalaska first. And there found that there was no really other alternative other than the Onalga, as I understand it, that could provide an adequate response in Alaska. So regrettably, he had to wire Dr. French and also a J.C. Bell, who was the superintendent of cannery on the Queechak, that they couldn't come. But he would get a message to the governor, message to the federal government that a response was needed. And in fact, the federal government did begin a response, trying to get a couple of ships together to send up. So, like I say, as a result of this work we were doing in Bristol Bay, the Coast Guard historian was interested in the history of the Onalga, of the ship's logs, and through their research did find some photographs taken by crew members of the Onalga in 1919. So most of these are snapshots of a photo album. And so I'll run through them. And I don't know, Ray, if you want to come on, or if we could bring Ray on, he could be able to identify maybe where these were shot. But I'll just run through them and comment where I can. Towards the end, I mean, we were interested obviously in the Inalga's response when it did get to Bristol Bay after it did leave Unalaska later in June of 1919. But by the time I got to Bristol Bay, there was really nothing they could do except gather orphans and bury the dead. Some of the reports we had were very critical of the Inalga and their response that we've seen. But the Inalga also met up with another Navy ship called the Marblehead that had been staffed by various doctors and sent up north. And some of those doctors and physicians jumped onto the Inalga, where they went to the Nushagak side of Bristol Bay, apparently. And the Marblehead and another Navy ship called the Vicksburg responded on the east side, the Naknek-Quechak side of Bristol Bay. So I'll just go through some of these slides. So I got to share screen again. And that would be this one.
I think you have to double click it again. It hasn't launched the PowerPoint.
Are you seeing it?
We see your screen, but it hasn't launched the PowerPoint. Maybe click the PowerPoint again, double click it.
It wasn't showing up in that little box, Sharon.
Well,
Karen.
just open it from there. Just double click the PowerPoint on your screen.
Are you seeing it?
No, it hasn't opened the PowerPoint.
Well, it's open on my,
Well, unshare your screen and let's try it again.
okay. Okay, let's try share screen again.
Does it work when we tested it?
I'm not seeing where it's not showing up where I want it to be.
Is the PowerPoint open already in the background before you did share screen? It
Doing that
wasn't.
right now?
It should be because we looked at it earlier.
I know. All right, now let's see. Okay, here we go.
Okay, now it's working. Now just make it full slideshow view.
Yep.
Yep, great.
Okay, everybody seeing that?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Inalga, Bering Sea Patrol 1919. The Inalga was actually a fairly new, brand new cutter, apparently, only manufactured a couple of years before. It was still not at the service of the Navy. As a result of World War II, all the Coast Guard ships apparently came under the command of the Navy, and this was the last cruise of the Inalga into the Bering Sea Patrol, where it had a combined Navy and a Coast Guard crew. So here we see the Inalga, just the boat. These again are photographs from an album of one of the crew members of the Inalga. And here I think they are docked at Dutch Harbor or Unalaska in
This
1919.
is the Unalaska dock right at the end of the spit.
Okay. This is the crew of the fella in the middle is a Captain Dodge. And this is, like I say, a combined Coast Guard and Navy crew. The guy on the far right, we have their names, but I think he's one of the physicians. So when they came north, they didn't know that there was any flu. This was something that they became aware of as they got up there. So here we are, we see the crew, I'm guessing, visiting an Aleut village of sorts. I don't recognize that style of house in the background.
I would be surprised if this is Unalaska because of the number of Barabaras that are there.
Have you seen these kind of structures before, Ray? Anywhere? So here we are, I'm assuming the cathedral in Unalaska, and it looks like they may be digging graves. When they arrived, according to the ship's logs, the disease had just appeared when they finally got there. Some of the crew were sent off to help with the sick. They only really had the one physician. There were children, I guess, at the Jesse Lee home that needed to be cared for as well, or help. And basically, they helped to feed the village with and brought out blankets and other supplies that they had on board. And a lot of these are rather, tragic shots like this of the crew basically burying the dead. Everybody wearing masks.
The previous picture was one of the cemetery at Unalaska. Yeah. And where they apparently buried people in trenches, as you see there.
Are these places still known or marked?
There's an area of the cemetery, but very few of the markers remain. And usually for Orthodox burials, there were only the crosses without names attached to them. And so there aren't very many that are actually identified as flu victims.
Yeah, I think we saw that earlier with these crosses.
Yes. Yeah.
This is the USS Bear. They did meet the Bear on Alaska before they sailed on to Bristol Bay. And the Bear did help. And then later the Bear went on up into the Bering Strait. And the Onalga met up with another ship and headed into Bristol Bay. There's the Bear departing in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like taking a casket to the graveyard.
And this was the road along the front beach. Yeah.
Apparently they took some time out to have tug of war contests with the folks on the Bear. Boxing matches. Boat races. So apparently several of the crew were assigned to take care of orphans. And so we have the Onalga actually created a temporary orphanage. I guess maybe the Jesse Lee home couldn't accommodate everything for everybody. So we have a few of these photos.
There's a very funny story about one of the sailors who there was a school teacher, Margaret Lewis, and she just had given birth to a child, and she died of complications during the flu epidemic. And the child was given to a woman to help raise or to nurse, and she did so until she fell ill, and then they handed the job over to a seaman. And according to Dr. Newhall, the seaman was a tall, lanky guy, and he came into the doctor's room. Dr. Newhall had been one of the first to fall ill during the epidemic. And he said, well, I've got a new job, got to take care of this kid and feed him. And Newhall looked at him and asked, are you going to bring it up on the breast or the bottle? And the sailor stood dazed for a moment and then burst out laughing. Well, by gosh, I guess it will have to be the bottle. Breasts are pretty dry, he said.
That particular incident of the woman you mentioned it's recounted in the ship's log.
Yes.
And I should send you that, Ray. This may be the gentleman that you were talking about. They do reference one particular sailor who really took it on, a big burly guy who took on really looking out for the orphans. So they actually had a little, I guess, building that was set up as the Onolga's orphan home, temporary.
The flu began at Unalaska on, I think, the 23rd of May. It lasted until June 6th.
Right.
And there were 44 people who died at Unalaska. According to the death certificates, 44, 46 by another count.
This is Karen. I just want to interrupt a second that we didn't really properly introduce Ray. So people who might not know you, maybe you just say who you are and your connections with Unalaska.
Sure. Ray Hudson, and I lived at Unalaska from 64 to 92, and I have written a number of things about the Aleutian Islands. And the flu was always very interesting because the number of people I knew had obviously memories of it. And one of the unusual things at Unalaska was that, at least at the beginning, for the first several days, the weather was lovely. And I remember Agnes Shagan, she was the daughter of the chief at that time, Alexei Yachmanov. And whenever we would have a run of good weather, she would get extremely nervous because she remembered that those were the conditions that brought the flu.
I'm assuming in one of these photos, we probably have a photograph of Benny Benson, who would have been there.
Yes, he was there at the time. And according to Simeon Oliver, Benny Benson was one of 5 children of the home who did not fall ill. And he said he thought it was probably because Benny Benson was too ornery, but he remembered Benny would sit outside of the home below one of the windows and sing to himself. Simeon Oliver said there wasn't even a dog for Benny to play with.
Yeah, we had one fairly prominent resident later in Bristol Bay, Charlie Nelson, who knew Benny Benson and also was at Unalaska at the time of the flu as a young boy, probably about the same age. And was one of the first native teachers in Bristol Bay. You see more of the kids. So was it that children got sick there? Because in Bristol Bay, we were finding the children, I mean, it was just something unique about the Spanish flu. They really didn't get sick. It was their parents and the younger adults.
I think that was true at Unalaska also.
So this is the USS Marblehead, the boat that the government also sent up to respond to the flu. And they met the Onolga and basically offloaded more doctors and supplies to head north to Bristol Bay. So the Onolga left Unalaska in mid-June. I don't have the date handy, and then went north to Bristol Bay. And this is the cutter Onolga. This is from a different photo album, but another one we discovered, really sitting right off of what we call Kanaknek, not far from the hospital. Kinnickinnic Beach. And so by the time the Inalga gets to Bristol Bay, as we said, the flu had really already run its course. And basically the crew could do nothing more than help resupply the canneries, cannery doctors who responded, and then go out to these. They connected with Dr. French, who you see here in the middle in the golf cap, and we had not seen this photo before. And frankly, their task was far more gruesome, probably in Bristol Bay. Certainly on Alaska, they were there as the flu was happening. Those who died were buried fairly quickly. But because of just the situation in Bristol Bay with scattered villages, the doctor was sick himself. Dillingham was overwhelmed with, several hundred deaths apparently, as well as the other remote villages where the canneries were located. So when they get to Bristol Bay, they send a doctor to relieve Dr. French, and then French takes these guys out to the remoter villages, and in this case, Coffee Point, Igushik, to see what's happening. And of course, they just encountered dead laying all over the place. And here you see basically a burial crew. And of course, they're now dealing with people who've been dead for weeks. In this photo, you do see Dr. French in the middle. This old guy on the left has an interesting story too. His name was Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, who was a fairly well-known PHS and Army physician during the day, and was actually at in the U.S. Cavalry for quite a while, and was at the deathbed of I can't remember his name now, not Sitting Bull, but the other famous chief. And he volunteered, wanted to go in to help the U.S. Army during World War I, but they thought he was too old. He was 69 or 70. So they sent him north to help out with responding to the flu. So that's the slides that are there from the Inalga. And so the flu finally gets out of Bristol Bay in late June. It's pretty much over by mid to late June. Now hundreds of orphans scattered all around the bay, mostly the canneries, the Alaska Packers Association, are putting them up in their canneries. And of course, as fall is coming, the canneries have to leave. So the decision is basically made to send them all to Dillingham, what we now call Dillingham, where Dr. French and his wife, and he had 2 kids himself there, but he had decided to retire, and so 1919 was his last year. He'd been in the region for a decade, basically founded the hospital in Dillingham. Pretty tremendous guy, apparently. And he was actually a successor of Dr. Romigs. But he had basically the hospital constructed, built. He did trips all over the place and established the health system there. He then left Dillingham in the fall of 1919 after getting basically an appropriation from the government to then build an orphanage, an industrial school where the hospital was located. So over the winter, there really wasn't any room. They had to get the kids out of these tents, and they actually, there was an identical building down in what we now call downtown Dillingham, a place called Dan Snag Point. There were 2 schools. The first school at Kinnickinnic had been converted to the hospital. An identical school in Chugyung, or Snag Point, was then used to house the kids for the winter of 1919, 1920. And then, I guess beginning in 1920, the hospital was expanded to then become an industrial school. So according to the census, which occurred right afterwards, we see that there were 120 some kids accounted for living in Chugyung or Dillingham at the time that were part of the orphanage. Others were in some cases adopted by families. But that core of kids, we think there were probably some 200 to 250 orphans ultimately from that, basically became the founding generations, founded the generations that have since followed. So that's pretty much the story we have from Bristol Bay and a little bit of Unalaska that I could tell from those photographs. So thank you.
One of the things I'd like to say maybe about Unalaska is that although the number of deaths was not great compared to other locations, there were several very significant Unanga who died during the flu epidemic. The linguist Leonti Sifsov would work with Yokelson. He was quite young, he died. Peter Kashiverov. There were several basket weavers, really prominent basket weavers from Attu, Mary Prokopiev, Martha Prokopiev, Anna Goli. They died. And so the impact, in a sense, was perhaps greater than merely the numbers. I think perhaps the measles epidemic around 1900, I think perhaps more people died, although documentation is harder to find on that particular event. But the number of significant people who died during the 1919 flu epidemic is important.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks very much for being able to join us. I didn't have notes on that to begin with, but I'm so
We
glad.
just decided this morning.
That's perfect. And it is informal to that degree. We're certainly privileged to have you with us and to add to Tim's presentation. And thanks, Tim, very much. We'll have a question and answer period at the end. So I want to move on to introduce Aaron Leggett as the next presenter and give him plenty of time to talk about the flu epidemic in South Central Alaska and how it irreparably changed traditional lifestyles as they became a minority in their own homeland. And so Aaron, who many of you know is he's on the board of the Historical Society. He's works at the Anchorage Museum and is a member of the native village of Eklutna and currently serves as its president. So he's and he serves today as a curator of the Alaska History and Culture at the Anchorage Museum. So Aaron, welcome. Thank you very much. And again, everyone, just be reminded at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. And so save them up for both Tim and Aaron and Ray, and we'll take time after Aaron talks. So Aaron, go for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Great, perfect. Well, before I get started, I want to take a moment to say what a difference 2 years makes. 2 years ago, I gave this presentation up in Nome on the 100th anniversary of the influenza epidemic, and here we are in 2020 in the middle of COVID. Also, on that presentation was the late Beverly Beaton, and I just want to dedicate my presentation to Bev. She was always a huge supporter of the work that I do at the museum when I first got started and involved with the museum, and was always encouraging. And she will be sorely missed. She's one of, I like to think of as one of the classiest people that I knew. So I'll dedicate this to Bev. And in fact, Bev contacted me just in July about kind of dusting this off and presenting it again. So I'm really kind of sad that she's not here today, but I know she's looking down on us. So a Dena'ina perspective on the 1918 flu epidemic. I know many of you are probably familiar, but we'll just sort of refresh. The Dena'ina homeland encompasses 41,000 square miles in south central Alaska, both sides of Cook Inlet into Lake Clark and Lake Iliamna and the upper Kuskokwim. And here's a little closer view. And so today's presentation will be primarily talking about the impact of the flu epidemic at Susitna Station with two firsthand accounts. So, as you guys are all aware, in 1915, Anchorage was selected as the headquarters for the Alaska Railroad, the White City or the Tent City. And then fast forward to 1918, and we have the flu epidemic. So with Anchorage kind of rising out of the forest, you can actually see here, the housing conditions were not optimal, and I think that probably in this area contributed to the spread of the flu, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's a picture taken by one of the railroad engineers, the Alaska Engineering Commission, the photographer P.S. Hunt. This is the main business district at Susitna Station. At that time, there were about 600 people living at Susitna Station. It was the main jumping off point to get into the interior towards the gold fields, Rainy Pass, the Iditarod Trail, and eventually you could get up to Nome along that route. So this was kind of the last business stop, but it was also a very important Dena'ina village. Here we have some Dena'ina people and some of the Euro-Americans there. In the background, you'll see this is H.W. Nagley's store. Many of you know the Nagley store in Talkeetna. Before Nagley moved to Talkeetna, his store was in Susitna Station. And of course, the store is still there. I mean, at least the building's there in Talkeetna. So it's a very important location. And what I want to talk about first is the woman in white right here is a woman by the name of Catherine Kane. She was the Bureau of Indian Affairs school teacher at Susitna Station during the influenza epidemic. And here this is taken before the flu hit, with most of probably all the Dena'ina men of the village. This is her niece, Loretta, who came to visit her at Susitna Station. She was living in Anchorage at that time, and she'll come into play a little later in our story. And we'll just start here. So there was a unpublished manuscript that's at the Anchorage Museum that Catherine wrote, and eventually was donated to the museum. And she worked in several different locations, and I don't remember all of them off the top of my head. But what we're going to focus in on is at Susitna Station. My account of my years at Susitna Station would not be complete without the story of the 1918 influenza epidemic, which was worldwide in scope and decimated our village with shocking vengeance. As in other parts of Alaska at that time, we were already frozen in for the winter without any outside communication or mail service. So as I was unaware of the flu raging in the States and other towns in Alaska when it descended upon us. On Friday evening, November 15th, as my people filed out from our regular night school for both adults and children, I listened with pleasure to hearing their happy voices as they sang on their way to their cabins. The next day, being Saturday, I made my usual periodic inspections of their homes. I was shocked to find that so many people were sick. As I passed to the Nagley trading post, the storekeeper called me and said, "Miss Kane, there's 4 sick Indians in that cabin over there. I found them with very high fevers and had difficulty in diagnosing the cause. As I proceeded through the village, I found several sick in every cabin, apparently all with the same symptoms. My diagnosis was that they probably had an epidemic of putrid fish for breakfast. How wrong was I? Exclamation point. Finding so many cases made me begin to wonder, so I hiked home and got my medical kit and gave them medicine for digestive disturbances and to allay their fevers. I at once decided that the epidemic was getting out of control and that I needed help. The storekeeper and I had a council of war. She has quite hyperbole here. We decided to send to Anchorage for help, and that night, when a musher came in from the Iditarod Gold Camp on his way to Anchorage, I hurriedly wrote a note to my niece, who had recently been married and lived with her husband in Anchorage. They reached her at the famous Hotel Anchorage and laid the matter before her. I explained our desperate condition to the traveler, had told him to hurry, and no matter what time he arrived, he was to awaken my people and tell them of our need. My messenger left us that Sunday night and arrived in Anchorage the next Thursday at 2 o'clock in the morning. As per instructions, he immediately aroused my niece and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Emard. Emard had the cannery there, who routed out the head of the local Red Cross, John Dunn, and petitioned him for doctors, nurses, and supplies for our stricken village. As almost every available medical worker and nurse had already been drafted to take care of the flu epidemic, which was then raging in Anchorage, too, it took from Thursday until Saturday to recruit any sort of crew for assistance. Headed by the Emards, with the dog team owned by Captain Eugene Norton, then set out. Norton was accompanied by his wife, a registered Red Cross nurse, another woman, a cook, Joe Lobner, and one other man, completed the party on its errand of mercy. They reached us the next Sunday, and after a long, hard trip via Knik over snow and ice, following a long, torturous winter trail around Cook Inlet. Before relief came, however, 6 of my people had died. As the ground was frozen too hard for burials, we laid them out in the church. The only 2 young men of the village who were not sick were kept busy making coffins, tearing down board fences and unused cabins to get lumber enough to make boxes for our dead. Luckily, the store could furnish us with nails. In all, we lost 38 of our people to the Grim Reaper during the epidemic that November and December. In that particular tribe of Indians, each one provides himself during life with a full outfit of burial clothes, and I was kept busy washing, dressing, and laying out the dead. And as has been pointed out in other in the other presentation, you know, she ends. This was a letter that she'd written to the Department of the Interior Bureau of Education that she included in her her unpublished manuscript. But she said the flu left us with another problem on our hands, that of the care and welfare of 22 children orphaned by its ravages. So here, let's go back. So as I mentioned earlier, these were most of the men at Susitna Station at that time. And in particular, I want to focus in on this guy in the back here, and I've got a close up. That man in the back there, because this is another picture of what I believe to be the same young man, and that's this guy, Shem Pete. So this was taken in Anchorage, probably about 1920, of Shem standing on the railroad tracks. And of course, everybody, or most everybody, should be familiar with Shem Pete's Alaska, an ethnogeographic history of Upper Cook Inlet. And Shem had this to say about his time at Susitna Station when he was growing up. There used to be a lot of people at Susitnu, at least 700, 600 natives, and whooping cough. That one came along and it killed quite a few. And then measles hit Susitnu. That killed quite a few. Then the third time, 1918, the flu come. That wiped them out, about 600 of us, when the flu hit in 1918. Susitna was a lot of people. I go back to Susitna Station from Anchorage to go to school, and a big flu there. First week when the flu hits, we lose 36. I lose my mother the first day. Then from there on, we lose lots of people. We just walk on the trail in the Susitna village. They fall down all over. We drag them inside to the house. Yes, we lose a lot of people. It pretty near cleaned up all the Susitna people, a lot of people. We must have lost over 100 native. Good people. Gee whiz, we get pretty lonesome. We only a few people left. Then Shem goes on to say, and anyway, we stay there at Susitna after 1918 several years, and 3 families there. They moved down to Tyonek in 1934. Simeon Chikalushin come up there to Susitna. He's so lonesome. Just a very few Tyonek people was there. He took us, we be 11 of us, brought us down. Not many people down Tyonek except for 3 Susitna girls, and each girl had 10, 11 kids. Right there, that was 30. Them young girls, they had the kids. There was 6, 7 Tyonek people left, that's all. They all Susitna people, they grow up. There's lots of Susitna people down at Tyonek. So what Shem's talking about there is, as a result of the 1918 flu epidemic, as Mike mentioned, it's a pivotal turning point for the Dena'ina because prior to the flu, the Dena'ina were the majority population in Cook Inlet, but after the flu, they became the minority. And there was a consolidation of several rather large Dena'ina villages that were consolidated down to the ones that we think of today at Eklutna, Kanik, Tyonek, Old Iliamna, Pedro Bay, Non-Dalton, Lime Village, Kenai, and Seldovia. And so this is another picture. This was taken, I believe, in, let me see, 1926. And from left to right, it's Henry George, Nora McCord, Tommy Alawan, Billy Pete, and Irene Efim. Henry George continued to stay at Susitna Station on into the 1950s and was one of the last residents. So there were a couple Dena'ina people that stayed up there, but the majority of them either moved into Anchorage or Eklutna or Tyonek. There's a Dena'ina prophecy that Shem talked about that was predicted in the 1880s. There was a shaman there that basically predicted the influenza epidemic or some major epidemic. He warned the people that they needed to be prepared. They needed to make sure that they had plenty of ammunition, axe, file, matches, because he knew that if something like this were to happen, that it would take a very long time for help to come, and also try to live off the land. And there's versions of this Dena'ina prophecy, and I'm sure that other Alaska Native groups have similar stories. The late Andrew Beluda of Non-Dalton told a version of this, and I can't help but wonder right now, with all the turmoil that's going through, what our world's going to look like after this. But it's an important value for Dena'ina elders to communicate to the next generation that they need to know who they are. They need to know where they can go to basically survive, so to speak. Where are good places to get certain animals, fish, berries, plants, so on and so forth. These are just some more pictures from Susitna Station, from some of the survivors. This little boy here was the late Sava Stepan from Tyonek. And that'll do it. What's interesting to me is it's not a perfect match, but it's incredibly close. Catherine's version of events and Shem's, account. Basically, the ferocity with which it hit, the numbers almost line up exactly in that first period, and I was really pretty excited when I discovered this in the archives of the museum. Unfortunately, I discovered it after we had finished our Dena'ina exhibition, or I would have tried to weave some more into it. But those photographs that she has are priceless because they're right at the time, and it really was a major turning point for the Dena'ina. So, Chanan, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, very much. What magnificent photographs. Good gracious. That's just terrific. And we do indeed need to pay attention to that prophecy, the lessons of that Dena'ina prophecy. It's time for a Q&A. If any folks who joined us have questions, let's see, I believe you should raise your hand if you wish to speak. And I'll also double check. Let's see, Eric has joined us. Do you have a question for either of the presenters, Eric, or do you want to add something to what the presenters have been talking about?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tim and Ray and Aaron, for the work you've done on this. And I don't have a whole lot to say. I work as a historian at Denali National Park, and over the years in some of the research, I would see there's a video. I would see connections, I would see evidence of the flu that hit one of our gateway communities, Nenana. And for those of you that don't know, Nenana is on the George Parks Highway. It was an important town for the Alaska Railroad, and it's about 50 or 60 miles southwest of Fairbanks. But we read a lot about Nenana because it's one of our gateway communities, and I would see sort of references to the flu at times. There's a photo in a book about Fanny Quigley that shows a picture of her at the Nenana Hospital. We don't know a whole lot about why she was there, but there's some speculation that she was there during the flu epidemic in 1920, working as sort of a volunteer nurse. I was sort of, I've been interested in how the flu affected Nenana. I knew it hit it hard in 1920. Last fall, before all this pandemic hit, I went up to Nenana, I was wandering around some of the cemeteries, and there's one on the southwest side of town where you can see numerous graves, and they're all from the first week of May 1920. You can see that it just hit. So part of my job at Denali is I write short pieces of history. They're usually pretty Denali specific tidbits about things that have happened in the park. But for this particular one, I was like, you know what, I need to, we have this pandemic going on, and obviously this is very relevant. I just wanted to sort of acknowledge 100 years later what had happened to Nenana, and hope that people could get, read some of the parallels in the language of things, and how that pandemic affected in multiple waves. And so I'll share in the chat, I'll share that article. I didn't prepare anything for this panel, but I'll share that article. I hope you all have a chance to look at it. It's very short. There's a lot more work that could be done about what happened with the flu in Nenana. Yeah, I'll share that article for everyone. But again, thanks to everyone else on the panel that contributed.
Thanks, Eric. Well, we have a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And I'm going to start with the first was a question from David Ramseur for Aaron. And I guess we just, I'll read, Aaron, I think you can see this too.
Yeah, I see it.
Why
I'll
don't
read
we
it back.
answer
Yeah.
live? Yeah.
Sure. So was there any successful medical treatment of the flu at the time? Did people try to isolate to avoid it? I'm not aware of any treatment, successful treatment. I think as far as isolating, yeah, I think they tried once they knew that it was, pretty deadly. It should be pointed out that, we had been through several epidemics before that, tuberculosis, smallpox. So they were familiar with, disease certainly, and the severity of it. So, but I think, one of the things that I think about a lot, and it goes back to thinking about Nenana, is that really, the founding of the Alaska Railroad. On the one hand, it did provide, the ability to get help once the disease hit, but it also, I believe, spread the disease. I can't prove it, but if they had decided to build the railroad 10 years later or 10 years earlier, it would have had a different impact. And so, again, in 1918, Anchorage, you couldn't even call it a town, really. I mean, it was in its infancy. Seward was a town. Susitna Station was a town, but Anchorage, they had just moved out of the tents and were just starting to build, the first businesses.
Thanks, Aaron. Let's go to another question by David Ramseur, but it's for Tim. And Tim, I guess you can read it. Can you see it okay, or you want me to read it out?
Why don't you read it out? So
David asks, sounds like most of the Bristol Bay orphans remained in the region after the flu. The question is, was there any effort to adopt them out to families elsewhere in Alaska or the lower 48?
Really don't have a lot of information on that. We did come across a photograph of the cannery superintendent at Naknek with an orphan from probably Sevenoski that he took down to Seattle, Washington area. The sense is that most of the orphans remained in the region. Some were adopted out to families, and many were raised there at Kanakanak. And that's, the more I listen to this, the more I think this history needs to be all put together somewhere, because it's been scattered, and probably if it hadn't been for COVID, we wouldn't even know as much as we're learning now. To Aaron's point, a question he was asked, one of the things we did find in Dr. French's papers was a treatment that the government had prescribed at the time, which wasn't really very much. And also in those papers were all the orders that were sent by then Governor Riggs out to French and other doctors to the West about quarantining, same kind of things we see today, shut down the schools, shut down the churches, post guards out your village, everybody coming in, you know, and there were health officers, typically the teacher. Then those were relaxed in Bristol Bay around February or so. You know, go back to school, those kind of things. Don't know how it got in. And Ray, one question I have for you is a lot of people blame Father Hotovitsky from Unalaska for having brought it in. Can't establish that for sure, but contemporary accounts do say that Father Hotovitsky came in for Russian Easter and everybody went to church. You know, whether they were in violation of the quarantine orders or whether they were relaxed, we don't really know. But a lot of people said that's how it got started, at least on the west side of Bristol Bay.
Any thoughts, Rick?
Curious what you know about Hotovitsky, Ray.
Yes, and he was a priest in Unalaska, and it's true that he had been out, but I was under the impression that he was visiting villages in the Aleutians. I wasn't aware that he'd gone up into Bristol Bay, which he very well probably did. And he came back in mid-May, and it wasn't long after he was back that the flu outbreak occurred. There was also the USS Saturn had come into port to work on the naval radio station. So it's possible that the flu arrived on that ship also.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate it. Did you want to add something else, Tim? We've got about 16 minutes or so.
No, I have a question for Aaron later, but go ahead.
Okay, let me move on. Sioux Sheriff has asked Aaron a question. I presume you can read it, Aaron, about.
Yeah, where was Susitna Station located? So Susitna Station was located about 20 miles upriver from the mouth of the Susitna River. It's kind of on a bend. I had it up briefly. I should have done a better job of locating it. And then what happened to the orphans there? Well, I think, you know, some of them were adopted by the survivors. I know that there was an orphanage / school over in Tyonek, Old Tyonek is what they call it, that I think had been established at the beginning of the 20th century. And eventually in 1925 was moved over to actually to Eklutna and became the Eklutna Vocational School that operated from 25 to 45. The reason being is that they wanted access to cheap coal coming out of Jonesville past Chicklin. So, yeah, I think that answers it.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Ron Inouye has asked a question, I guess for everyone, to comment on the sources that you've used. What comes from personal institutional records, academic collections, or what other sources need to be tapped is on Ron's interest. So Tim, why don't I start with you and then we'll shift to at least to Aaron and we can ask Ray as well.
Well, one of the primary sources were the reports of the cannery superintendents and doctors in 1919 that were very extensive from the Alaska Packers Association. Around 1922, they compiled all these into a little booklet, sort of praising their response. I think they were getting some complaints in Congress about being too big, and they wanted to show how humane they were. So they published a lot of these reports. And that's, you know, it was in the library in Dillingham. There's a few copies around, but these reports are in the archives of the Alaska Packers Association. So they're there. A lot of what I got came from the French family. Dr. French had saved this correspondence, his official correspondence, some of his personal correspondence, and when, like I say, this little box showed up and we contacted them, and there was this huge trove of stuff that you're sitting there as kind of a, you didn't think of yourself as an historian, but all of a sudden you got this stuff and you're trying to figure out what it is. And then you piece the story together. And so that was a primary source. And then things just pop up. Report from a couple of nurses in Cordova who were sent to help Dr. French. And so they traveled from Cordova across the pass into Lake Iliamna, where they did not find the flu at that time in the Dena'ina communities. And so an extensive letter that was written for, the Sisters of Providence Nursing School. Those are the kind of sources that I have. And then there's a few things in the state archives, correspondence between Governor Riggs and the Alaska Packers Association.
Thanks, Tim. Aaron, you want to comment on your sources?
Yeah, again, the Catherine Kane collection at the Anchorage Museum and the Shem Peet material all is housed at the Alaska Native Language Center, been translated by Billy Peet and Jim Carey, and obviously published. So, his was firsthand account. He lived up till 1989. So those are the primary ones. But I think Tim's right. There are, it's little bits and pieces, and you just kind of follow these little, breadcrumb trails, rabbit holes, and you just kind of, and I'm sure there's by no means, this topic has not been fully researched. We're just scratching the surface. And so I'm sure there's things in the National Archives. I'm sure there's, correspondence between various government agencies. There's a lot out there. It's, in a way, it's such a monumental event, but it's been pretty poorly documented, I would argue, up to this point.
And I should point out that Tom Alton has posted, and as a note to all the panelists, to all of us, other sources of information he's found useful as well.
Yeah, I just copied that for all attendees because when it goes to all panelists, it's only us. So.
Oh, okay, thanks.
And same with Sue Sheriff had a link to another article related to Eric's thing. So if you're going to put something in the chat that you want everybody to see, do it to panelists and attendees.
Okay, thanks very much.
And Nancy Bird had a question about accessing Tim's.
About access to the film?
Yeah, and I copied that into an answer to her Q&A. I copied that link, and I'm hoping all the attendees can see it, but I'll put it in the chat as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate it. Karen, thanks for putting that out there. Let me shift on to a question that Bill Schneider had. I guess you guys can see it. It looks like it's for everyone. How do we assess the impact on the children in terms of their understanding of heritage and identity after the epidemic? Tim?
You mean children today, or the children that were the flu or victims?
I presume of the children who experienced it, but it would roll down to new generations as well.
Well, as Aaron said, I think there's a lot of the story that's still out there that we don't know. When we did this little project for Bristol Bay Native Corporation, and we showed that film at their annual village meeting in December, people began to have some stories about the flu as it came through their family. Some of those old high school projects that were done back in the 70s and 80s, where high school kids went around, and like the Foxfire thing,
Right.
Some of that was done in Bristol Bay. They captured stories from survivors at the time. And we, in this little book that I did for Bristol Bay, basically I copied primary sources. I just put them in there as the primary sources and let the story come together.
Cool.
So I'm hoping that will generate more, because you can't go to Dillingham, Naknek, any of those villages, and basically 2 generations back, they come from an orphan.
Let me shift to Aaron. Any thoughts from you about the impact on the children? that you?
Well, I think there's two parts to it. I think one, for a lot of the survivors, it was a terribly traumatic and horrible event for them, and so they had what we now know as PTSD and guilt of surviving when they're the only one in their family. I think it had the impact of further marginalization of Alaska Native people and sort of what controls they had of their own destiny and culture and values. And so, the historical traumas can't be missed. But I also think there is that incredible sense of resiliency as well, and trying to hold on to whatever cultural heritage that existed,
Mhm.
or was left, I should say.
Ray, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just one. Anfisa Shepsikoff was in her late teens in 1919, and she remembered how orphan children were taken into local homes, and this resonated with her for a long time. And in the 1960s, when a number of children were removed from Unalaska by state social workers, she felt that local people could very well have taken those children in, and if they had been consulted about it. So I think there was an example given in 1919 that wasn't followed then in the 1960s.
Eric, do you run across anything that would enlighten us about the impact on the children?
I have not. As I said, I've just sort of done my efforts haven't been very extensive into what happened in Nenana. I do know, and this touches back on Ron's question about sources. Some newspaper accounts showed, orphans, call for people to take care of orphans, and to the source thing. Digital newspapers, as more are becoming digitized, this helps us sort of look at how this event was being interpreted in Alaska and elsewhere. One thing I was going to say is the article I wrote, it's published on Denali's website. I don't have a method to like distribute it widely, but sometimes they get picked up by local Facebook groups. And Chris Capps, the reporter for the Newsminer, contacted me and she said, the Nenana Facebook group has been commenting on your article. There's a lot of people chiming in saying, this is what I heard, this is what we heard. And it got me thinking, these people need to be interviewed in that community about what they know. They're not that far removed.
Like your next paper.
Well, exactly. And again, of course, now we have a pandemic where we're trying to put these mitigations in place, so it makes it difficult to conduct oral history interviews. But it is something that I've told my superiors that it would be very nice to do an oral history project surrounding this with some of those community members, where we can find out, some of these impacts on children and other topics related to the flu.
Perfect.
So
Okay.
Mike,
Yeah, go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
well, just related to that, I just remembered there was this one report in Bristol Bay by an A.H. Miller who had been sent up in November to help construct temporary housing for the orphans for the winter. And in his report, he has this sort of statement that just stands out. He's saying, the orphanage work opens a door of opportunity for effective work unhampered by the continued downward drag of primitive parents not equaled in the entire Alaska school service. So if that gives you some indications how it impacted the kids, he's basically saying, now that all the parents are dead, we really have an opportunity to basically bring these kids into the 20th century.
Before I forget, I did want to also mention, I know that for Eric, ironically, the Indian cemetery at Nenana, where many flu victims, I would have imagined, died from, had to be moved because the railroad tracks literally went over the top of it. The railroad bridge going over the Nenana River, where it leaves land, is right where the cemetery was. And so there's a collection at the museum, the Alaska Engineering Commission. Let's see, who is the photographer? H.G. Kaiser in 1922 clearly denotes that. And a number of years ago, when I was working at CIRI, we wrote an article about the cemetery at Nenana having to be moved. And we interviewed an elder from there, and he talked about hearing stories of, basically caskets. They didn't do it right, and it got all mixed up and just very hastily done. So, sort of an added insult to something that had already
Not
happened.
surprising. Yeah,
Yeah.
Eric, it looks like you want to add something.
I've heard horrific stories about what what happened during that relocation of the cemetery, and
Right.
that yeah.
And they didn't get all of them, and that I've heard, bodies were, eroding out of the bank. And
Oh, great.
Yeah, and Nenana, at the confluence of the Nenana and Tanana River, if people have the chance, if you're traveling through there, the cemetery I went to earlier this spring is on the southwest side of town, and that's not the native cemetery. Those are a lot of the residents that died, and you can still see they must have updated some of the crosses with the dates. But if you go the native cemetery where it's been relocated, which is on the north side of the Tanana River up on a hillside, it's a beautiful spot. But yeah, I often wonder, a lot was lost.
I don't want to cut you off, Eric, but we're running out of time.
Gotcha.
So I have to be a mean moderator for a moment. Rebecca Paulson had a question for Aaron. Can you read it, Aaron? It's there. She's asking, it seems like there are multiple waves of disease. And has there been a full accounting of the total deaths from these various areas and overall? Was that May 20 deaths that Eric mentioned also the flu, or was there something else?
As far as I know, there's never been. Part of the problem is the censuses. You compare them between 1900, 1910, 1920 are pretty poor from what I've seen in Cook Inlet, at least, and that's my area of expertise. After 1930, they get a lot better, but in 1920, they were pretty inaccurate, and they were also, like today, people would be out traveling, and so it's hard to get good numbers.
Thanks, Aaron. Again, for the sake of time, Ron has another question for Tim about the film and whether or not it has been shown in other outlets around the state.
Well, not yet. I mean, the film has been prepared for this Diamond NN exhibit. It is on Vimeo. And we did do a half-hour program when Rhonda McBride had her show still on KTVA, where snippets of that were shown. And so that is also available just on the Bristol Bay region.
So one last question I want to mention, but also remind everyone that there are written questions that have been posted to all the panelists and attendees that you can read and see what attendees or panelists have to say about those questions. But one last question live. Aaron, this is from Catherine Berner. Aaron, you mentioned Catherine Kane's niece and her husband. What was their role? Did they arrive after the distress call and continue in significant ways to serve?
It's not entirely clear to me. I think she was able to motivate people in Anchorage to care, to get what Red Cross could be spared. She was sort of championing, I guess, the cause. Mm-hmm. And I think without that, they probably may have not gotten any help.
I see. Okay. Well, again, we are out of time, and it's we need to move on to other things. But it's been fascinating panel discussion by you guys. It's been educational and especially brought up a bunch of really good questions about where we find this information, this kind of information. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Thank you to Ray for joining us, Tim.
Yes, thanks, Ray.
Yeah, and Tim and Aaron for your
Thank you, Tim.
presentations. And Eric, good to see you again, sir. And we'll see you, I guess, later.
Yeah,
That's it for our session on the 1918-1920 epidemics that raged through Western Alaska, so Central Alaska.
And this is Karen. I'm just going to jump in with some housekeeping, which is to remind everybody that our 2 o'clock session this afternoon will be the business meeting, the society. Everybody, we encourage you to attend, and that is not part of this webinar. That is an actual Zoom meeting, which probably most of you are familiar with, where you all will be on screen and be able to present and control your own video and audio. We'll have some people giving some official presentations because it will be election results, awards, the various committees from the board will present, and then in memorials and hearing from some local historical societies. So if you do not already have that link to the meeting, which you should have because Joe sent out an invite to all the conference registrants, but if you don't have that, if you could email Joe, and it's members@alaskahistoricalsociety.org, all lowercase, Alaska Historical Society, all one word. And there was one other question here from Shauna. I don't know if it relates to the pandemic, but in the early 1940s, the old Dena'ina Cemetery in Kenai was destroyed by construction related to the pre-war FAA and airstrip. So she just wanted to add that comment.
All too often, that's the case, isn't it? Well, thank you again. And we'll see you in another session during the conference. Thank you very much for dealing with this.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.